Hello, everyone, and welcome to Life, Hope, and All Things Canady, the voice of wisdom. We are continuing our discussion today on your health is your wealth. And guess what? Your health is truly your wealth. Now, in terms of the discussion, we've been talking about some things that you can do to ensure that you make constant deposits into your health and that you constantly are not making withdrawals. And so we want to talk about how to make deposits and to limit the withdrawals because guess what? Oftentimes the withdrawals come whether or not we want them to or not, and they often come from just daily living and from the things that we are ending up doing every day. Now, in terms of our health and our wealth, we have a goal of being wealthy. Now, what I want to do is expand this topic. First of all, let me say, with my show, All Things Canady, all things matter all the time. All things, that includes your health, that includes your goals, it includes your purpose in life, it includes those things that God has for you, and it basically includes everything that we do. And so today I am going to approach the topic from the standpoint of eating. You know, we've been talking about eating, we've been talking about exercise, and so I am going to approach the topic in terms of biblically. So, if you have your Bible, I want us to look at the book of Daniel because Daniel is often the person that people refer and reference when they're talking about healthy eating. Now, a lot of times people attribute some things to Daniel that maybe Daniel didn't necessarily say, but I am going to talk about health, wealth, and our diet in light of Daniel. Now, if you know anything about Daniel, and if you know anything about the book of Daniel, then Daniel was one of the Hebrew boys that was taken into captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar, and as a Babylonian slave. He was being groomed to serve under the king, which meant that the king was requiring some mindset changes of him and was requiring some lifestyle changes. And in essence, Daniel said, no, this is not what I'm going to do. There are certain things that I believe in. There are certain things that I know that work for me. There are certain things that are beneficial to me, and those are the things that I'm going to do. So, in essence, what we find is that Daniel basically said, and I was trying to find the verse, but he basically said that I'm not going to eat. Let's see, we look at Daniel 1 and 4, and we find that they were trying to what I call Babylonize, or change how he thought and what he was doing. And so they were trying to Babylonize their language. They were trying to indoctrinate their hearts and their minds in terms of how they thought, so that they could be effective in the king's service. Now, the king, in order to do this, they had to teach them, they had to try and change their way of thinking, their eating habits, and everything else about them so that they would be effective in the king's palace. So basically, this is what the world seeks to do. They want to change us, change our ways of thinking, change the way that we operate so that we are effective in their way of thinking, in their mindsets, in their lifestyles, as opposed to the way that God would have us to think and as God would have us to be. So David Daniel basically was told and gave them a challenge because they were trying to challenge him. Look, if you don't do what we say, if you don't eat the way the king says, and if you don't do everything that he says to do, guess what? You are going to be killed. Daniel was like, okay, look, give me 10 days, to not eat the way that you are telling me that I need to eat. Give me 10 days. Then you compare us to everybody else, and then you make your decision. So basically, he said, just feed us pulse. Now, what pulse was a mixture of vegetables and water, and it was a way of putting stuff together. Because one thing you have to know is that the common people, peasants or whatever, ate a lot of bread. They ate onions. They ate vegetables, and these were the things that their diet consisted of. Now, they ate these things, and the thing you need to also know, though, is, well, first of all, let me answer the question. You may ask, well, what was the king's food? What did his food consist of? Now, from my study, I have found that basically his food consisted of fowl, which was chicken or turkeys or geese or things like that, fish, lamb, blood animals, probably cows or whatever. Then you had honey and barley and dates and figs and olives, melons, grapes, and wine, and also drinks that were made of barley. Now, when you hear this, then basically what you also see is that the king's food consisted of fruits and vegetables, because a lot of times people erroneously say that, well, the king didn't eat vegetables, he didn't eat fruits and things like that. Well, they did, but it was probably in the preparation of these foods and in how they used their foods. Because one of the things that Daniel had decided was that he was not going to go against his rules and the things that he had been taught in terms of eating what's clean, eating what's unclean, sacrificing foods to the gods and things of that sort. And so he wanted to maintain an essence or a level of control over his own life. Because what you have to remember is, in all of this, what the enemy was trying to do, or the king was, and I say the enemy because that's what the enemy tries to do to us, but the king was trying to change Daniel's way of thinking. He was trying to change Daniel's belief system. He was trying to change how Daniel ate, because he knew that Daniel, if he did that, then Daniel would come over on his side. The other thing we find out about this is that the king wanted to make his way of living, his way of eating, seem very, very, very attractive to Daniel, so that Daniel would desire to eat the way that the king ate and do the things that the king did. Now, I don't know if you look at a lot of pictures from medieval days and biblical days in the past, but oftentimes you will see the jester over in the corner, and he's real jolly, and he's doing the dancing and whatever. You see the kings, a lot of times they're overweight. You will see them with this lots and lots of food on the table, even though there would be grapes. For instance, you would see the ladies feeding them grapes, things of that sort. But there would be a lot of food all over the table, food everywhere, which would imply that there would be a gluttonous spirit, overeating, eating to your heart's content, and not really having any restraint on the amount or what you were eating. So Daniel followed God's instructions regarding what was clean, what was unclean, also not drinking and eating to excess, not drinking to get drunk, because a lot of times you would see that the kings were drinking, they were just really having a good time all the time, and so their food had a whole totally different purpose for them. Also, meats that contained blood. Daniel did not do that as well. Now, so in terms of all of that, what I ascertained and what God revealed to me about this, in looking at the whole thing, was number one, after the 10 days with the challenge that Daniel gave, he said, come back in 10 days, look at us, see what our demeanor is like, see how we are, and then you make your determination. So after the 10 days with Daniel, and the three Hebrew boys, they were having pulse, or the vegetable soup type mixture, and water. They were healthier, they were smarter, they were wiser than any of the other people who were being trained by the king. And so out of that, what I get and what God revealed to me was, number one, that Daniel was intentional about what he was going to do. He knew that there were some things over which he didn't have control, because the king had them in training, learning the different customs, learning the laws, all these things from his culture. But basically, Daniel had decided in his heart that he already knew what he believed in. He was sure about who he was, what he believed, what he thought. And he had already determined that, so that in terms of what the king was teaching them, Daniel was like, okay, yeah, if I am going to be of use to God in this whole thing, then yes, I can take what you're teaching me, but then I can also compare it to what the Word of God is telling me, and then that will be what I do. And so he went about with intentionality and with discipline. He was disciplined in what he did every day. And so these are things that we need to make sure that we try and do. He was saying that, your traits, your trends, and your tendencies are not going to be what determine who I am. I know who I am. I know what my beliefs are. And so this is what I'm going to do. Daniel also had a level of self-control that we find very admirable in him. He had a self-control. He knew with intentionality what he was and was not going to do. And so then he was able to exhibit that self-control in what he did. Then the third thing was, then he knew what he believed in. He knew what God's word said. He knew what he was going to do in terms of being obedient to God, and there was nothing that was going to sway him from that. He also decided that he was not going to be swayed by looking at the way that things appeared. It appeared that the king was having a good time. It appeared that the king had it going on. It appeared that the king's way was right. And that is what the world would have us to believe today. What they're doing is right. How they live is right. All the different things that we find that were going on in the book of Daniel are basically going on today. There are things that are trying to determine how we think, how we eat, how we live. And this is what Daniel was going to have control over. Then the other thing we find is that Daniel was going to end up using the king's platform, or God was going to use the king's platform and what the king had going on. He was going to use that to end up elevating Daniel. Daniel was going to be elevated to a level in God and the things that God would have him do based upon the word of God and based upon his obedience. So what am I saying to us today? That we have to determine and know what we believe. We have to know what we are going to do and what our level of self-discipline and obedience is going to be. Now, so the thing also that struck me about this chapter is that he decided to drink water, because the word of God, we know that our bodies are made of water. We need water. And the Bible talks about strong drink. Well, he was deciding that he was not going to do the strong drink thing. Now, what does that say to me also? That says that with the strong drink affects your thinking. It affects your capability to exhibit self-control. It determines whether or not you can use sound judgment. And so he decided that he was not also going to do the strong drink thing. He was going to drink water once again and pulse. I think, though, the main thing that we see about this is self-control, determination, intentionality over the body, over the mind, so that we can be accessible and available to God and for His use. Now, so think about it, because a lot of times what people focus on is the fact that, just what he ate. But if you will study, you will find out that some of what he ate, the king ate vegetables, the king ate fruits. The difference was in the fact that there was a lot of meat in the king's diet and there was a lot of strong drink. And probably desserts, I don't know how they made them back in that day, but I'm sure that in terms of, indulging and indulgences, then there were certain indulgences. So we find that Daniel had a mindset that he was going to do what was right. So now what do we learn from this? That we have to have a mindset that is a growth mindset. Now, in a growth mindset, well, basically a mindset is the way of thinking. And the Bible talks about tearing down strongholds. What's a stronghold? It's a deeply rooted way of thinking. So we have to break and tear down some strongholds even to be healthy. Because in terms of being healthy, a lot of the things that we think are not the best things for us. They are not the most healthy way of thinking. What the world tells us about our diet, what's good, what's healthy, how it affects our health is not necessarily the best thing that's going to make us healthy, wealthy, and wise. So a growth mindset. That is what we need to have. Basically, what that means is we're open to learning. We're open to expanding our level of knowledge. We're open to learning different ways of doing things. And we're willing to cut out things that we know don't work for us. If there's something that we know does not work, then we are willing to cut that out. If there is something that we're not doing that we should be doing, then we are willing to incorporate that into our lifestyle. Because as I have said before, and as Dr. Miller also said, type 2 diabetes is referred to by the medical community as a lifestyle disease. A lifestyle disease. Basically what that means is that our lifestyles contribute to the development of this disease. What's our lifestyle? Whether we're sedentary or whether we move around, whether we're eating a lot, whether we're eating proper things, whether we are indulging in a lot of high-fat foods, a lot of sugars, a lot of foods that we should not be indulging in. And so by that, we are also taught that, yes, there are some things that you can do to control whether or not you develop some of these things. Now, in terms of developing these things, and that's not to say that, you don't have any control over your health, or that there's not a role of heredity in this, or there's not a place for, whether or not you're predisposed to certain things, because yes, that's true. But that doesn't mean that you have to develop it, because what we're saying is that there are some things that even if you end up developing those, they don't have to be as severe, or they don't have to develop to the magnitude that they are really, really, really debilitating, and things that will keep us from our purpose in God. See, that's one of the enemy's tricks also, is that If he can't get you one way, then he'll get you another. He'll get you, then okay, so you want to have a purpose, you want to have a plan, you want to do the things that God wants you to do. Okay, well, that's fine, that's a good thing, because he doesn't mind us wanting to be obedient. He doesn't mind us going to church. He doesn't mind us reading the Bible. He doesn't mind us doing all the things that God requires of us. The only thing he does is try to sabotage us so that we won't be able to do those things. So you can have a mind to get out and worship. You can have a mind to serve, but guess what? He has no hands but ours. He has no feet but ours. God has no mind but ours. And so if those things are not working, guess what? We cannot get out there and be effective disciples. We cannot get out there and do effective ministry. And we cannot do effectively the things that God would have us to do because our bodies don't want to cooperate, or our minds don't want to cooperate. So what I'm going to talk about just a little bit today, I'm going to give you 10 ways that we can try and make the foods that we eat healthier, and we can do what we need to do to have a healthier lifestyle and to make our foods a lot healthier. Now, as with Daniel, he didn't have a whole lot of control over his diet, but he knew what he wasn't going to eat. He knew the things that he was not going to put in his body. So what we can do is we can determine, okay, what we are not going to put in our bodies, and we can control what we will put in our bodies. So number one, and Dr. Miller talked about some of these things. So if you need to, you can go back on my Facebook page and look at some of the previous shows where we were talking about this topic, or you can go on the light.live online and go under the podcast section. And under the podcast section, you can find replays from the previous shows. Now, so the first thing that we can do is what? Cut down on fat. We can cut down on the amount of fat that we eat. We can cut down on the amount of fat that we cook with, and we can alter our dishes. I call these makeovers in our recipes and in our everyday cooking. So, number one, we can use oils that are high in the good fats, the poly and monosaturated fats. We can use less fat than the recipe calls for. And we can also just sometimes leave the fat out altogether. There are air fryers and different other things that we can get to cook our foods and cook things that we enjoy, but to cook them a lot healthier. I haven't used the air fryer yet. I'm planning to buy one, but I'm told that you can have fried chicken, but it's not as crispy, but it's fried chicken, rather than the greasy fried chicken that's laden in fat and laden in oil. And the other thing about cooking your own fats at home is that you are in control of how much fat is in your food. And see, this is what Daniel was doing. Daniel was controlling how he put whatever into his body and what it contained. So now with the going to a fast food restaurant, for instance, when you see those big fryers of oil, you don't know how often that oil is changed. You don't know whether it's the healthy oil or not. You don't know how, you don't know a whole lot about it. Because I have taken food from fast food, and a lot of times I take it and I get a napkin or a paper towel and I soak some of that fat out of the food because it's so saturated with fat. And one of the things you have to know is that this fat gets into your body and clogs your arteries. Why? Because the same way that it congeals on top of a soup, or when you leave it on the stove and it gets congealed, then that's what it's doing inside your body. So we don't want to put a lot of that in our body because it would clog your arteries. It clogs, vessels, and your body can't get the blood, and it can't get the proper flow of what it needs for you to function. Now, The second thing is to cut down on salt. I have quit buying salt altogether at my house. I buy lots of herbs, lots of different spices that season the food just as well, sometimes even better, because what I have found now that I'm not using a lot of salt is that salt tends to mask the true flavor of a food. You know, you taste the salt, but you really don't taste the flavor of a vegetable, or you really don't taste the true flavor of whatever it is you're eating. And so we need to cut back on the salt. Use things like Mrs. Dash. This is something that I use, so I can talk about it. For fresh herbs, as I said, lemon juice, vinegar, mustard. All of these are things that tend to be very good for seasoning food. Now, also cut down on your sugar. Use less sugar, because oftentimes the sugar that's in a recipe is so much more than is needed. For instance, when I'm making peach cobblers, I use half of the sugar that the recipe calls for, and I find that it's still sweet, it's still satisfying, but it's not that excessively sweet taste that a lot of desserts have. So basically, cut the sugar in half. Another thing you can do is substitute the baking types of sugar substitutes in your baking when you are cooking sweets, when you're making pies, and when you're making cakes. You can use those things in the recipe as opposed to using regular sugar. Another thing is to use fruits. You can use dried fruits when you're making certain things. Use a dried fruit because it's sweet and you don't have all that excess sugar that you have to add to it. So that's another thing. Number 4 is to increase fiber. Now, why fiber? Because fiber helps you to stay full longer, number one, and fiber tends to put some of the bulk and the healthy things into our recipes and into our daily diet that is going to help us to have less glucose in our system, for one thing, and it's going to help you to have your body function properly in terms of elimination and all the other things that your body needs to do. So how can we do that? Number one, we can add brown rice to recipes, add brown pasta. You can add bread. For instance, if I'm making a meatloaf or something, I will crumble brown bread, wheat bread, into it rather than white bread. You can use a mixture of wholemeal and plain flour when you're baking sometimes. Just check the health section, and there are lots of other things that you can try. Rice flour. There are lots of alternatives. And what I have found is that a lot of these things really don't alter the taste of the food. The food is actually very, very good. So what am I saying? We need to change our mindset, because a lot of this comes from our mindset. Oh, that's going to be nasty. That's not going to be good. I got to have my sugar. I got to have this and that. No, you don't. You do not have to have all of those different things. And when you're making crunchy toppings, for instance, to go on top of things, you can use things like cornflakes, ground up. You can make crumbles out of other ingredients instead of a lot of sugar and a lot of butter and all of those things. Do like I do, because I research, I read, and I am looking for alternatives. And one way to find those alternatives is that you have to make an effort to find those things. Number 5, your soups and stews. When you're cooking soups and stews, let them cool, and then you ladle off that dried, all of that fat that has settled on the top when you cook with the meat, or when you cook with fat in it, when you cook with butter. Let it cool and then skim that off before you eat it, because those are unnecessary calories. The taste is still there. The taste that you want is still there, but you don't have all that excess fat going into your system. Also, cut down on the meat that you put in the stews and increase the vegetables. Increase the amount of vegetables. Not only are you cutting the calories and the fat, but you're also adding fiber. And we know that fiber is very good for our bodies. 6, sauces and dips. Replace your cream, your whole milk, things like that with low-fat yogurt, low-fat sour cream, skimmed milk. All of these things are things that we can replace in our recipes. So that's something else we can do. When you're having cheeses in recipes, use less. But see, now that's a big culprit because we want to fill up the macaroni and cheese with a whole ton of cheese. Cut it in half. And another thing, grate the cheese and spread it throughout the recipe because then you don't need as much. And also use some low-fat cream cheese and low-fat cheeses in your recipes. Mayonnaise, replace mayonnaise with yogurt a lot of times when you're making recipes. And use vinaigrette dressings. Vegetables, flavor your vegetables with herbs. I've already said that. Cut the oil and cut the butter. And with meat, lastly, trim the fat from the meat. Trim the fat, remove the skin from like chicken and other kinds of meat. Remove it. And have a drip pan when you're grilling so that the fat can drip away from the food while it's cooking, and then you won't eat all of that. Bake, broil, or roast your foods. These are all things that we can do. And lastly, freeze fruit, and these are so delicious. Freeze fruit, add it to the blender, add some yogurt and a little bit of water, and you make delicious smoothies instead of drinking high-calorie milkshakes. So there are many, many things that we can do, and I am going to have Chef Audrey, and many of you know her. She's going to be on a subsequent show, and she's going to be giving us some delicious recipes where we can actually try out some of these substitutions and be healthier. So in closing, let me just tell you, we got to change our mindsets. We got to have and develop a growth mindset. And in order for a mindset to be one of growth, it's got to be open. It's got to be a mind that can be stretched and developed. So we got to be able to do that. So start thinking today about how you can intentionally control what you eat, how much you eat, how you eat, so that you can be healthier, wealthier, and wiser. So until next week, when we continue the discussion on being healthy, wealthy, and wise, your health is your wealth, then continue to look into and try to implement some of the things that we've talked about. So I thank you all for listening. I thank you all for your time. Please share this video and this message because there's so many people who need what I have to say and what God has imparted unto me. So until next week, y'all be blessed and take care.
You for experiencing the wisdom of life, hope, and all things Canady with his life-building attitudes and thinking from the perspective of timeless wisdom. Remember that you are valuable, you have purpose, and God has a plan for your life. Feel free to connect with me on Instagram and Facebook at All Things Canady. Email comments and prayer requests to allthingscanady@gmail.com. I look forward to our next time together.
Okay, y'all follow me on Facebook under All Things Canady, Instagram All Things Canady. Read my articles in the Middle Georgia Informer. The next one should be out on this coming Friday, and I have an article in there which is the second installment of Your Health is Your Wealth. And it will be talking more about the things that I've talked about today. So y'all follow me, and if you have any questions or comments, either inbox me or hit me up at allthingscanady@gmail.com. All right, y'all be blessed and take care.